This French overture, of course, has dotted rhythms, but the dotted rhythm is not an obligation. He was the step of the great king of France, Louis XIV, who, entering and facing his court, would step and turn his gaze upon a member of his court, and when he stayed longer with his gaze on this or that given individual, the musicians of the orchestra playing on the balcony would stop with his step and start again after his next step. And this uneven step, this dotted step, became known as the French overture, which Bach also composed in the genre style of, in the imitation of these European harpsichordists before him, who traveled and brought the different stylistic experiences and transmitted them, like the bees do on flowers, Froberger from Frescobaldi into Germany, and so on. So this French overture is not French per se, as the French harpsichordists Couperin and Rameau would do, because the notation of Bach is didactical, really pedagogical. Most of the harpsichordists and the, of course, Baroque musicians of the day didn't notate the details. It was left to the performer. It was mostly about notating the main harmonic or melodic notes, and the rest is to be ornamented and decorated and composed, not just decorated and not just ornamented. Therefore, the dotted rhythm is not constantly always the same, and therefore, even played on piano, and that is, regardless of the choice of the instrument, it's a wrong battle actually to have. It's not harpsichord versus piano or organ versus keyboard or clavichord versus some authenticity through the instrument. Of course there is an obvious chronological authenticity of the harpsichord, but also there is an intelligent translation, and not just literal translation of the harpsichord on the piano, like from a language to another. And I think the length of sound of the piano allows for certain tempi which harpsichord couldn't or didn't have to not be able to. In other words, it was not a restriction as we could think of it today sometimes from the point of view of the piano. It was just a fully blossomed, beautiful necessity to play on the harpsichord long values through arpeggiation, to display the notes like petals of a flower that appear and that grow, and if you plug them together, the tastes of the third and the fifth, perhaps a passing tone, perhaps a port de voix in a cacciatura, this flourishment of the sound, if plugged together, might cancel each other in terms of the richness. So you sort of display them. And mostly the harpsichord music makes us think that it comes in what we call the Baroque, which they didn't, of course, in their own time, comes from the earlier polyphony of Renaissance, where the inner voice, the tenor or the bass, mostly were the ground up thinking. And so we have the walking bass, and then the top part would be an emanation of that bass and not a melodic line which is thematically beautiful and solicitates a harmonization, while the decorations, even in the Romantic era of Chopin, become thematical, as we will see in the Andante when he goes Bach. That could be very well the melodic line of a ballade by Chopin if he uses it. Just like he uses this augmented or diminished third, augmented fifth, or diminished fifth or augmented fourth. All these intervals which are dissonant and which are tense, who need a resolution. And so then the short values, the ornamental quality of these decorations becomes here only in Bach a decoration, so you have to go for the main notes, and then inside he writes it down didactically, really, like a play like me. But when he was teaching, according to what we know of his teaching, he was encouraging them first continual knowledge with the harmonization, and then alternative decorations. This alteration to the text was a composer's lack of will or decision for the note juste, the real exact note that I want, the real effect I want. Where is my leading tone? Where is my suspension that will create a sense of pain or suggest a release and a tension and all these effects. While encouraging improvisation of the decorations, Bach still notated every note, unlike the harpsichordists before him. Because after all the musicians of the day, in their day, studied the style of their day in their region and relatively traveled, with the exception of few great ones who gave us all these cross-influences in Europe, mostly local musicians. I don't speak of the geniuses, I speak of the daily musicians who supplied the churches, the courts, and the different music needs on a daily basis. For them, it was just a matter of learning the skill, how to circumvent the basic notation, and giving them the sort of pleasure to ephemeral way of cooking differently the same meal, basically, by a decoration which won't be even notated. But in fact, today we are so far away from this time period. The studies of music are no more humanistic and general musicianship oriented. They are skill trained and focused. So we have editions which give us everything already engraved in stone. And then we have, of course, competitions which standardize through these editions the clean performances compared to the non-clean performances, if that is to be an accident or by choice. Then you have this past early 20th century Busoni eccentricities, which today are accepted, but wouldn't be, I would say, advised, especially when you're a teacher and you send a student to a competition. You don't want them to be ill considered, even if trained to understand a tradition of the past, which is to decorate and redecorate with slight differences, but maintaining the structure of the piece compared to the recitation of each note, which is expected today for the norm from which you eliminate people at the competition. I know this is very basic and not always as refined as the individual cases can happen, but it is a moral obligation to inform the student that this is how it used to be done. That's how the music grew from the bass up and not from the melody down. This is how some of the notes are more meaningful than others. For instance, they are the gestures, as we call them, for the melodic line. The upper sixth, which represents love or emotional energy, because it determines major or minor. Of course, in Baroque music, the major and the minor as an emotional concept of happiness and sadness vehicled in the piece is lesser meaningful, in the sense that the structure and the construction prevails, and the emotional content is more embedded but not so displayed. For instance, it would be unthinkable comparison of Romantic era and Baroque to play the first ballade in question by Chopin in major. Whenever truly taints it with a certain perhaps darker or whatever color people can think of, it's in the eye of the beholder, but it doesn't change the mood so drastically. It can be heard. The Italian concerto could be and still be grand, and even if compared to the total impossibility, in my view, to play this convincingly, since it's already charged with the emotion of the funeral march, it's impossible not to be in the funeral mood. Therefore, it has to be in minor, though it can be subtly in major in the middle section. All this to say that the choices of tonalities, but in this case of major or minor mode in the Baroque, are perhaps a little less driven by the emotional content than by the content itself. Music being the language that speaks of itself. And of course we put on it our own, we pour into it our own emotional or sensual or sensitive to the different moods emotion, but by itself it's only what it is. It speaks what it is. It is what it is. So it is true that in Bach's notation, for all those pianists who have played it or studied it, there is a 16th note rest, and then a 16th note, and a dotted 16th note 30 seconds. So it's 1, 2, except that because of the additions, and that was the notation of the day, in Baroque days they didn't dot the rests. Therefore, they only dotted a note. In this case, the D to the F through the E passing tone, delayed as a dotted rhythm for the French overture style. But when it comes from a rest in the first half of the beat, you don't notate a dot on the 16th note rest in those days, but it's implemented as if it had to be. In other words, you should be playing and not risk the wrath of Urtextians, who would consider that this is sacrilege, and just informed musicianship. Now, what do you choose to do with this information in the performance on the piano? Is it that you're going to try to provoke, and you think that this detail would change something to it? Probably not. It's considered legitimate today because of the additions that sort of globalized the culture of the knowledge of music, compared to the Baroque days where the students copied from the teacher's book to study the piece, which is how I studied it myself, even if my parents led themselves financially to buy me scores. But my teacher, Mademoiselle Boulanger, as a child, when I started there, asked me first to write it down, then after copying it, to write it down from memory without even looking at it in terms of keyboard, and then play it from my own score so that I can realize what I really know of the piece as a composer himself knows the piece. This kind of apprenticeship, which was used in the Baroque very often, created a sense of variety of details, which gives musicologists today a plethora of opportunities to compare various amount of manuscripts or sources that come from different scholars, students, and students of the masters. But ultimately they didn't really, I wouldn't say care, but it didn't matter the detail then, because obviously they didn't have a unified edition as today most of the time in the different music schools all over the continents people use the same. But once you're informed, what do you do with it? That's like culture. Once you cultivate it, what do you do with it? Do you display it? Do you just hide it? Or do you use it creatively? Or do you do it generously by teaching others? Or do you just keep it for yourself? Or do you feel superior to the others because you know? No. I don't believe that was at least not the case of my studies. My teacher always told me to be humble and tolerant for the others and intolerant with myself. At the same time, she also said that I should forget everything I had learned in order to remain driven by my intuition. Of course, it's quoted in knowledge, and the problem is the balance, that when people have too much of the one, it dries up the other. But I personally find it very striking to play the opening, and not each of them, perhaps. Each of the beats has to be dotted, because the King of France didn't stop the same way for each amount of time to gaze at a different member of his court who was elevated temporarily in the hierarchy through the gaze of the king's son. And the orchestra accompanied that uneven rhythm, but that uneven rhythm was not constant. That's what I wanted to say. Therefore, perhaps we should consider it too. Now, of course, the plucking on the piano is very more natural. Somebody like Beethoven composed his Pathétique way after the Baroque era ended, which we date 1750 for comfortable deadline that it is in the middle of the 18th century with Bach's death. So 30 years later or 40 years later in Vienna, Beethoven writes the Pathétique Sonata's opening, which has dotted rhythms and striking chords, and it's also in C minor, but is not having the vocation of being an, at least I think so, in his eyes perhaps even not French overture-like. But fortepiano obliging and no more harpsichord is exploring the variety of hammer, as he called it, hammer clavier, the instrument, the keyboard with hammers, the contrasts. So yes, you plug together and you obtain this kind of bunched sounds, not with, let's say, a later Schumann display, always with the tenth and the open display, string quartet, chorale, rather like a punch, and then a contrast. Of course, you wouldn't do that. Yeah, of course you wouldn't do that. But the fact is that there are similarities between the chord and then the dotted rhythm, tension release, and then the next chord in the French overture genre Bach is exploring here. At least in the Sinfonia part, which meant, in Greek of course, agreement, symphonos, is the idea of the concertante demonstration of the different aspects of the partita, of a suite of dances, which Bach organized and froze into his choice, unlike the French harpsichordists who gave you the choice to make your own partita out of a different series of dances in different keys for which harpsichord was tuned, for which you could do a sarabande in G and you can pick up among a few and organize it with other dance in G, and so you can make your own suite, a little bit like a sort of a sandwich that you make with different ingredients, customized. Bach doesn't allow you to customize. He decides for you which partita will have which what. And Let's make again the pedagogical tool of Bach, who notated even the decorations, but also decided of the order of things. So in the Sinfonia we have three parts that, of course, dotted rhythm, grand, majestic opening, followed by the what he calls andante, walking, pacing, in the genre of the aria, like in the slow movement of the Italian concerto. Or a 25th variation from Goldberg. So overly ornamented, decorated, and expressive, rhetorically speaking, projecting melodic line with 30 seconds like here. And when he stops on a note, usually it's a suspended suspension. The whole purpose of tension and release is obvious there. And then fast-paced one bar a beat. Of imitational fugato style for quick fingers. So this kind of triptych of majestic, paced and running is almost like as if the Sinfonia opening the second partita in these three parts of it, or components of it, sort of resumes the whole partita itself, which will go starting for the traditional Allemand, the German dance, which of course means German in French. I'm sure Bach must have been amused by that, not ein Deutsch, but ein Allemand. That was a traditional slow-paced dance, followed of course by the courante, which means running, corrente in Italian, or courir in French. So it was a dance where, of course, people hold hands and run in circles, like in a rondo. And of course, the mid movement sarabande, which is in the Baroque era, what Haydn will take for his Haydn sonata form a few years later to establish as the slow movement. Sarabande was the slow dance, but in fact stately as the first, but nevertheless a little bit more introspective. And oh, you have so many examples, like the first partita. The central piece of the suite of dances would be the sarabande, which paradoxically originally was a South American very erotic dance that was banned for its let's say sulfurous content by the King of Spain when the conquistadors brought it back from the Americas, Mexico, and made it to a stately slow dance, which became the slow dance, but nevertheless that's how we know it. And then, therefore, the Allemand moderate, courante, faster, and the sarabande slow. And then the last two movements after that, going into the finale of it, which should be a jig, but in this case it's not, makes a crescendo rhythmically. Between slow, fast and fastest, slow, fast and fastest. So the Sinfonia has the three all in one, as if an overture, like opera overture, sort of embeds all the leitmotifs and just displays the whole opera in short, and then gives you a taste of something ahead of time before you even tasted it. So you get familiar with the situation and the development of the characters further in the opera. So when you start the Andante, as a pianist, and specifically as a pianist, because of the musician, and specifically because of the musician, you have to first think in terms of where each line leads me to. For instance, the first subphrase finishes to the dominant, just to take it as an example. And then you start thinking, within these notes, which are the main notes? How do I undecorate? Which are the blue notes, the real notes? Which correspond to the major harmonic movements. It could be... So basically a little bit more skeletal. And then, therefore, the notes in between, mostly, often the 30 seconds, should be played air legato. Just to let the piano's intense touch as an instrument become a little bit more clear, almost like aerial. And in contrast with the more intensely played long values, and becomes too didactical as a performance to overshadow and over brightly demonstrate the long values versus the short values, but it's more about texture than dynamics. It's more about, rather than, because this kind of crescendo of emotion in the short values is exactly what will become thematically the decoration in the Romantic era, as Chopin does all the time. So in the Baroque you wouldn't do, or you shouldn't do that, because the expression doesn't come in the swell of the short values. It comes in the tension that the long values create by their harmonic counterpart of the walking bass, since it's up-down. That's interesting. Freudian is down-up, is exactly that. The bass is expressive and the melody decorates the leap of the sixth with these passing tones. So you have a driving bass which nurtures the beauty of the melodic line, which has its own expressive ascension of the sixth, in which inside you have the decoration. So if you play, of course, in terms of expression of the piano as an instrument as we know it in the Romantic era and forward, then I think it's a nonsense, not stylistically and not pedantically, not, oh, it's Baroque, no pedal, or no. It's nothing to do with the legato or the pedal or the romantic feeling. It's to do with the fact that you want to be eloquently clear and not belittle the beauty of the gestures, of the given symbolic gestures of these, whichever intervals are there. You overwhelm them if you play expressively the short values. So you have to play them not detached and neutral and say, I only mean the meaningful notes and then the rest I just play meaningless. That would be, of course, an exaggeration. But the fact is that in the practicing one has to perhaps write it first down and then decide to... The decorations are the written 30 seconds whenever given ornament, which is a codified decoration, such as mordant, from the French mordre, which means literally bite, or when it's written in 30 seconds, it's a decoration. I would call it so to put away the confusion that could arise between what is notated, for instance, the conclusion of this andante. These are this is decoration, 30 seconds by 4, and here the dotted rhythm of the dotted 30 second has a mordant indicated, so it could be a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. One could go through the cobweb of variations, possible suggestions about how to play which ornament from the Versuch, the essay by C.P. Bach, who writes about how to play, at least in his point of view, and then favors and various tables of ornamentation from Rameau on, Couperin on, indications. It was almost like sort of a glossary, you know. For me, as composer, you would play this way. That's how they suggest. But nevertheless, when you have a notation which is just a symbolic notation of an ornament, you cannot expect it to be performed exactly as you like. If there is one way you like as a composer, you just leave it to the fancy of the performer, regardless if it's in 200 years or right away. Of course, when it's right away, they do it by assumption, like you learn your childhood language by ear, since as a baby, that's how you reproduce the sounds. But when you learn a foreign language as an adult, you go through so much more grammar and drills. So I would say that for us, it's not as natural to play Baroque music as for them, because that's all what they did, and we do so much more and different things. So we have to re-immerse ourselves in their time period whenever they couldn't, of course, chronologically, it's an oxymoron to mention it, play Scriabin on a harpsichord, or imagine him. Therefore, we can, but that means that we have to also be careful to stylistically get closer to what we think is the truth, even if translated to an instrument that doesn't correspond to the composition of it. But then again, I think the gesture of the intervals prevails the choice of the instrument. It's all vocal music, it's all gestural music for expression, it's all psychological manipulation, as Professor Wright so beautifully says, that the rhetoric of the melodic lines speak by itself, so to say. It's not so sung as it becomes in the opera in the 19th century, the bel canto, the beautiful singing. It's more about speaking, telling, convincing rhetorically, like the oratorians of the antique days of Greece and Rome. The eloquence, the virtuosity of the eloquence of the speech, and therefore the choice of the adjectives and the pace of the adjectives corresponded to how you attracted the agreement of crowds. This kind of situation at a more simple personal level as a performer today is still embedded in the quality and the choice of the articulation, and the quality and the visionary clarity of where the melodic line brings me and through where. Often when students ask me, should I play the pedal, should I play dynamics, I'm not allowed, but it's Bach, but can I don't want to start with restrictions. I want to start with intentions, with jubilational pleasure to play it, in the sense of duty, not only pleasure, but because of the pleasure of the music, is a duty to serve the music. And to serve it right, you don't want to think no pedal, because I have one. Of course you could use anything. The point is what is that you want to display from what you've read in your inner ear and comes out for the audience through you, and not so much through your instrument only. You can be suggesting instruments of orchestra on the piano when you play. You could be suggestive of the harpsichord. You can be suggestive of many things, but ultimately what matters is how you behave your phrasing, how you bring your phrasing to a conclusion, if it is, and how you have a run-on sentence, and how all these things articulate themselves. I believe in the air legato. It's a terminology that came to mind when I studied as a child with Clifford Curzon, a great British pianist, who was teaching me a Mozart concerto, and he did not put it in words. He said, "Emile, look at this," and he was... It's like speaking, and the language comes from the movement of the tongue, and the pronunciation comes from the resonators, and so that we know how we project our voice. So in a way, the articulation could be in 467 by Mozart, with a beautiful phrasing over legato, or it could be a little more crisp, where the first note leaves just time before the next, a little nano gap, which is practiced precisely, like the 1,000 stones or million stones that are organized in a certain way to hold in ageless cathedrals. And it's a construction of aired articulation. Which re-establishes some kind of fortepiano of the day of Mozart's time, texture compared to the more connected sounds that you can obtain in things that are incompatible for a fortepiano. Sorry for the wrong note. Even the trill there is a shaking. It's no more a trill in the sense of embellishment. So inevitably, when the sound of the piano is made for resonances and depth and grand orchestral capacities, Rachmaninoff composed, and Scriabin and Stravinsky and so forth, in the Baroque, you remain with a touch which, by the airing, also organizes the pulse. So it's not just the quality, the beauty of the color of the sound is an aesthetic choice. Today I'll wear blue, tomorrow red. No, it's more about bridging and bringing the important notes, and in a way the transparency between the two pillars brings the lightness of the structure of a given architecture, for instance. So I would rather think for the air articulation of the decorations more like an architectural device of a canvas over, let's say, pillars. Without it, it would be heavy, but it will be a little bit more, more expressively thick. Also, you have to take in account the constancy of the moving bass, which would have been a continuum if it played alone for the aria. To play a realization rather of a moving bass continuo, like you would do if you accompany another instrument or an aria. Of course, I managed to ridicule myself by singing, which is one thing I thought I wouldn't do when I will teach one day, had I told myself. My teachers always sang to express the melodic line or whatever tone of the piano I was supposed to find. Piano teachers, theory teachers, they all sang. And I always thought it was pathetic because, of course, they're not singers and it sounded awkward. I understood the message, but I didn't enjoy the messenger for that. I thought it was kind of silly, actually. And of course it is. And I promised myself, like one tells oneself after an airplane trip when a baby cried next to you, if I'm a parent one day, I'll make sure my baby doesn't cry to disturb the passengers. But they do. And you do on your turn. So I was talking to myself, when I teach, I'm not going to sing. And then I find myself singing all the time. So I guess it's a doomsday for certain things when you teach, as you are taught. But in any case, that demonstration of the aria is futilely ridiculous as it was in my singing. It was just to demonstrate the importance of the bass in the left hand, which should be neutral but present, discrete but there, and therefore the air legato, air conditioning of the 30 seconds allows for the passing tones to be heard without an effort and without having to play them out. I mean me, you, and my part, your part. It becomes very much of a dialogue, when in fact the aria is not a dialogue. It's really a monologue, and then the accompaniment is there just to acquiesce. And whenever the third section interesting to observe is that when he plays quick articulation and fast, compose and play and improvise, for Bach, fugato, imitational, contrapuntal situation, he manages to make sure that you always keep one voice speaking in 16th notes in this case, and one listening in 8th notes, which we air on the piano. Perhaps more imitatively of the harpsichord's natural decay, where the beauty of the beholder of the harpsichord is to play unevenly to express the emotional and beauty of each detail which is embedded inside the 16th notes decoration. You do. And beyond the harpsichord fingerings with or without thumb, it's mostly about the direction of the design of the line. And so you have 1, 2, 3, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the subphrasing, which could be almost uneven in order to delay the meaningful note instead of accenting it. Beethoven would put a sforzando later, but in Baroque the important note is mostly delayed. Just to meaning, to blossom it, just a little delay gives it its importance, and then the release after. Of course, on the piano we're used to the beauty of it, or the teaching of it is to play even, not uneven, which is an aesthetic choice between the two instruments, harpsichord and piano. And therefore, if you start playing unevenly on the piano, however you want to imitate the harpsichord, it becomes a mockery, and of the harpsichord and of the music itself. Therefore, it sounds like you're drunk. I mean, it's not acceptable on the piano. Nor should it, because it's the piano as an instrument, become all rhythmically metronomic. I think there is room for this gestural element, which comes back from to the analysis of the real notes. Undecorate, and you redecorate as it's written by Bach and not only improvised by you, because today we don't do anymore, this tradition is gone, but you can still suggest it by the quality of the difference of the articulation and touch. But Bach nevertheless keeps in this fast tempi mostly the 16th notes in one part and the 8th notes in the other, alternatively, so it's like and the other one speaks and you go so it's, and then it would be, of the departure on the second 16th notes, not to accent it da 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 da, but da 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 da, to go to the beat, merging in traffic rather than attacking the note at the beginning, even if it's off the beat. When you exit a long value, to start it under, and not. These redundancies which give the texture lack of readability rather than visibility. To be readable, you want it to be flowing. And to be flowing, you want to make sure that the 8th notes are detached, aired. Perhaps not all of them. Some of them can also have a little bit of a Baroque cello or gamba for subphrasing. It's not per se that all 8th notes have to be staccato, all 16th notes have to be air legato, and all tempo has to be always kept. And it's not true. It's yes, but not all the time. And so from time to time, if you feel like making it a bit softer in terms of articulation, like soften the edges, compared to, in fact, you should have this map, like a GPS view of the piece, so well that you could take a different path in the garden, but from the GPS you know where you're going, even if you appear to be almost losing yourself, sometimes playfully, sometimes by accident or on the spot, but you always know where you go, so you can take different ways to get to the same point, and perhaps the piece reveals itself to you differently every time you play it. Not because you're hopefully not because you're unattentive to the detail, but because you allow yourself to explore a different way of tossing this rhythm. And sometimes these various various variants of the expression don't mean that you have no opinion. It means only that you're watching the elements display in front of you, and you just benevolently, with good feeling, goodwill, let it just happen, and you become a listener plus. Of course, at that point you have to be very much in control of your technique to allow this through practicing hold and poke. For each articulation, each lifting of note, it enters in the hand's memory, muscular memory, then rhythm, just to make sure that the articulations will be equal when necessary, especially when 3 and 4 and 4 and 5 as fingers have connected mutual tendon rather than 1, 2 and 3, which allows to hold better articulation. But we practice this on the piano with the scales to improve that. But anyway, at the end of the piece, usually of the contrapoint that goes fast, Bach uses the opportunity of the stretto, where the feeling for stretto is when the two parts speak in 16th notes at the same time. Gives you the illusion of an accelerando, when in fact it's just bubbly talking at the same time instead of listening to each other like it was. But so you feel like it's busy. Do fa sol la sa fa sol la si do re mi fa sol la re si la sa fa sol la fa mi re do si la sa fa mi fa la. And so it's almost like as if the two characters of this playful duo, after exposing the theme and then the answer, in listening alternatively to each other, merge together into the traffic of the like torrent of water. And I think this, starting with the stately, continuing into the narrative andante, and the very playful, allegro, one can call it, or calls it usually. It creates that sense of rhythmic accelerando anyway through the choices of the values rather than the tempo indication, since of course the metronome was far from being invented in Bach's time, since it was at the end of Beethoven's time that Mr. Melzel came up with it, for the delight of all our students, or not. But nevertheless, counting yourself is more important than the machine counting for you, independently of what you play. And speaking of the counting oneself, the opening is in 4/4, so is the andante. So very square pulse, 2, 3, 4, 1, and then when he goes to the third section of the Sinfonia and conclude the Sinfonia. A bar a beat, but of course inside each bar it's 3/4, and therefore you pass from a 4/4 to 3/4 to something more dancey, something that gives you the capacity to use hemiola, which is the hidden marvel in every piece that is not in 4/4, because you have the capacity of 3 times 2, 2 times 3, alternatively on top of each other or together, and sometimes in different spots, and you can hear it in 6/8, like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, or in 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. 6, 8, and 3, 4 are the two sides of the moon. Sometimes you see one, sometimes you don't see the other one, because you don't see the full moon all the time. I would say that there is a 6, 8 in each 3, 4, and there's a 3, 4 in each 6, 8. And if you have this independence of pulse in mind, you're so free to glide, and it's like an ever-regenerating beat that glides you through the piece, instead of falling on a downbeat systematically, vertically, with the two parts together and do a 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. If you do 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, it gives you another larger step. So you go 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. or on the same time, the two of them. And the lightness, the bouncing, and it gives a sense of jubilational lightness, basically, instead of becoming a organized. Of course, every score is organized because it's sliced by bars, and the bars have these bar lines that sometimes appear like literally prison cell bars, and we feel like our mind is reduced to what we see, and we always see those bars so well organized, so well slicing the musical thoughts of the composer, which by phrasings go way over and above, regardless of the tempo, because of the choice of the structure of the group of bars, or the way, you know, that is what it is. The speech, it's not all rhyming with the same amount of steps. It's not a poem. It's a prose. It's a narration. It's lively. Therefore, it has to be interactive with each other parts. Of course, polyrhythmic things between Schumann and Messiaen become so elaborate. Here it is, I wouldn't say that it should be necessarily demonstration of polyrhythmia just because of the sake of it. It's nothing worse than be pedantic as a performer and say, I'm going to induce into it what I think it should be, so I just prove my point, which you do when you teach. Because there are elements of it which are food for thought. But when you perform, you should accept it to sort of blend into the thought process of what you think the composer wanted to convey through it, instead of however clever, intelligent, or scholared and well informed your musicianship is, that would dictate your performance. Then it becomes more of a making a point rather than letting the music itself guide you, and sometimes use different elements of pulse, of contrapoint, of articulation, of singing, of decoration, ornamentation, just to participate to the feast. But just like a good cook knows how to make, or a given cook, a good sauce with given ingredients in given quantities, that gives a type of taste which your taste buds will translate in a certain way compared to somebody else. Same thing with this. No matter how much you codify the edition, no matter how much recordings there are, how many comparatives one can make of comparables, there are so many things that are not comparable, as the touch, as the quality, like a singer's voice. Here is a pianist's touch. And then from there on, you sign with your musicianship your interpretation spontaneously, or sometimes when you practice it is less spontaneous, since you repeat and you restart. So it becomes more of a rhetorical spontaneity, like the artifice of the actors, that transforms into natural feeling, and you feel like rupture of disbelief. All of a sudden, I don't see the actor act. I think he is or she is the character, and becomes the character. And while you play the Sinfonia, I think you are not more or less harpsichordist or more or less Bach. You're the music itself. So if you write it first and you learn it after, and you sing it and chew it and play it and enjoy it, so to say, chew it when you solfège it, if you solfège it. But if you can't, just la 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 la, so let's see, do re mi fa. It becomes an extension of your musicianship, of your language, just like when you speak a language with a given accent or with a given expression of endearment or excitement. And of course, teachers give you rules, and musicologists also, and scholars put it into a nice package with logical facts of chronology. And that is important. Again, the informed performer should remain an enthusiast. And perhaps to a certain extent, always keep the beyond and after the knowledge of the acquired facts that you learn about by curiosity or by given teaching or combined, what it is that makes me play this piece. That literal industry of playing it, pleasure, touching it, sculpting it. I think that is the spontaneous joy that we have as a child, and we tend to lose sometimes as adults, and we're told to be all these things that we're supposed to become, or we think that it is, that represents adulthood, let's say, some kind of maturity. But I think one should enjoy the fact of playing, and not as another verb, but it's that it is the verb of playing music is the enjoyment. Of course, it's hard work, but it's play. Play in the sense of enjoyment of the real meaning of the things. Not play as a belittling the elements, but transmitting what you have received as beauties from the piece to the audience through you, and filter the best, the least your own personality on it, except your own understanding of it. A free narration. Thank you.